Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of I Like to Read with me, your host, Rachel Polanski. Today, I am very, very excited I can't even say joined right before even saying your last name right, to be joined by Tom Beaujour. No, I messed that up. Yep. Okay. I said it right.
Yeah, Beaujour.
Beaujour, the author of Nothing But a Good Time, the uncensored history of the 80s hard rock explosion, or one of the co-authors. Thank you very much, Tom, for joining today or tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So your co-author, Rich, does he go by Rich Beanstalk? Is that right?
It
Richard?
depends. Richard is probably
Richard and Beanstalk. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. He was unable to join us today, but we are lucky to still have Tom. So Tom, I would first love to know, how did you and Richard meet? And then also, how did you guys come up with the idea for this book, this crazy uncensored oral history?
We met years and years and years ago. I'm about 4 or 5 years older than Rich, and I was the managing editor at Guitar World, this like mid 90s, and Rich started as an intern there. I think like the second thing I ever said to him, because he kind of can like talk slowly sometimes, like, dude, you smoke a lot of weed. But then it was uphill from, I think he was offended by that, but we ended up working together at Guitar World for a couple of years. And then while I was doing Revolver, he was still at the same company. And then we worked together on a magazine called Guitar Aficionado, which was like a luxury guitar magazine. And basically, whenever we weren't talking about specific stuff that had to do with work, we would always drift into a conversation about like 80s glam metal. Like it's both of our passions. Like I had no escape because I was like 15 in 1986. So this stuff was just going straight into like my
you were like the prime target.
Yeah. My prefrontal cortex was not like formed and it just went in there. He got into it like younger and could have escaped, but is equally obsessed with it. So we always talked about this stuff, and it wasn't something that, especially in the 90s, something that you really got to cover that much in, even at a guitar magazine. And we had discussed doing the book a little bit, and I had talked to him about it. And then I left the magazine and a couple, like 4 years ago, like I also produce, the other thing I do is I record bands and produce bands and stuff. And I got fired by this band. And for some reason at that moment, I had like this light went off and I was like, I got to do this book. Like I can't, like, I don't know why. It just like was like, like, fuck these guys, I'm doing this book. And I called Rich like 20 minutes later. Just like literally all happened in like the space of an hour. Like this band was like, we don't like your mixes. And I was just like, I'm doing this book. And then I'm like, Rich, do you want to do the book? Because I knew I couldn't do it alone. And he's like equally addled by this music. So like we knew, and we both really wanted to do it, and we just needed, so we just decided that now was the time. I think we really both would have been brokenhearted if like somebody had beat us to the punch on this.
Yeah, you guys were kind of the seminal encompassing of the entire decade. I mean, I'm sure there's been little bits and pieces and biographies and whatnot, but to really have, you guys had all this unfiltered access. You said, you couldn't have done this alone. Like, what is it like to co-author a book? Because I imagine it's not like, well, I'm going to take turns writing this page and you write this page. Like, how does it work to have your individual visions come together?
The way we did it was that like, so we interviewed about 200 and change people for this book.
Wow.
And so, because the whole book is, quotes. And so we interviewed. And so basically what we first did is just divided up the territory.
Right.
And we each have like different areas of obsession. So it worked out well because they don't actually, we both love all of this music, but there's certain things like Rich was absolutely obsessed with Guns N' Roses and sort of like their formation story. And I am totally into White Lion and a couple of the other bands. So we were actually able to divvy it up pretty well.
That's awesome. You didn't have to fight over anybody?
No, not really. And then we would, and like the thing about having two people is, if you've been trying to get somebody for like a year to do an interview and they come back and they're like, I can do it tomorrow at 3, and you can't do it tomorrow at 3.
You have your...
Like somebody else can, because you're not going to call back. You're not going to be like, hey, can you do it like Saturday?
Right.
And so, you know,
like,
so
no, someone has to be
us,
there. Yeah.
Yeah. So it gave us this flexibility, and it also just prevents you from going. The best thing about co-authorship is that it prevents you from going insane. Because like you're in the middle of the book. It took like 3 years to do this book. And there's certain points like when you've interviewed, you know, these 7 people, but you can't get this one or that one. And like there are days where you're like, oh my God, we're not going to be able to finish it. And you feel like you're going insane. And having somebody else, and usually both people don't feel like they're going insane on the same day.
Hopefully,
so you can lifeline to your co-author and be like, I feel like I'm going insane. And usually the other person, hey, no, it's cool. We're doing this and this. And so we would actually just like pull each other out of like spirals when we were in spirals. And it's just, I don't even understand how I would have done it alone. Like having somebody that you can talk to each day about the project, who's involved with the project, is absolutely amazing. And we made it, like, knock on wood. I'm actually knocking on wood. Through the whole process. I mean, we had a couple like little like, but like really, it was really pretty seamless. So it was great. And then basically what we did was, you know, some interviews that he did were for chapters I did and stuff like that. But basically then we just split it up and we each wrote different parts of it. And then weaved it all together. The way that the book was made, this might be too specific, is like, you know, we've got all of these bands and their histories, and it keeps bouncing back and forth between bands. But the way we actually wrote it is we would each write, like I wrote all of Poison all the way through.
Oh, okay. And then you decided where to sort of.
Then you start, and yeah, so we had these we had these long strands. If anyone's not watching and listening, I'm making a long strand.
No, yeah, I like that. Yeah. That's really cool. So you have like a whole, like a sort of what's like a cork board of like, you had the whole strand for Poison, and then you decided sort of where to divvy up. Okay, that's really cool.
And that made it much easier, because that way when you're concentrating on making that story compelling, and then the next story compelling, and hopefully if they're all compelling, then they'll be compelling when they're put up too. And that was how we did it.
That's awesome. So what was your favorite interview, and what was your most difficult? I mean, I don't want to say least favorite, but probably like the hardest interview for you, I should say.
My favorite was either, actually, like it's where like I really like it, and some people don't even know who he is. Like Vito Bratta, who is the guitar player in that band White Lion, was somebody who does like no interviews, and kind of sounds like a dude from The Sopranos because he's from Staten Island, and was like one of the greatest guitar players of the era.
How are you able to get him if he doesn't do many interviews?
It was super. You know Eddie? Do you know who Eddie Trunk is? He's a DJ. He DJs
sounds really familiar.
He DJs on like Sirius XM. Ozzy's Boneyard and
that's what he sounds so familiar. Yeah,
and he does like a bunch of other syndicated radio shows. And I'd known him, and it was like a Hail Mary, where I was like, dude, he had done the last interview with Vito, which was 13 years ago.
Wow.
And I was like, you know, and I know.
Did you think it was going to happen? Like, or were you really?
No, and it happened really fast.
That's awesome.
Like, it was like I emailed Eddie, and I was like, dude, could you put like a, you know, this is what we're doing, and can you put a note through to Vito to ask him? He's like, yeah, I'll do it, but like, you know, he never does anything, so don't be disappointed. And then like 2 days later, it's like, I'll do it. I don't know, like awesome. It just happened at the right, and I totally freaked out because like, oh my God. So that one was great. I mean, most people actually, I have to say, were pretty excellent. You know what I mean? Some people are less good at being interviewed than others.
Yeah.
But, you know, but by the time we got to that, so I'm really not dodging your question. There was not one.
No, I understand.
I've interviewed people for like, you know, other things where at the end of it, I was like, fuck, that was the worst.
You're like, it's like nails on a chalkboard. You're like, okay, I can't make it like 15 minutes because that's too short. And they took the time, but you're like, I totally
you're
understand.
Like sweating and you're like, I'm not getting anything. And you're just like, oh.
No, you're super easy to talk to too. So I can imagine it must be like extremely difficult if you're interviewing someone and like, they're not giving back to you because
it's the worst. And so like that, you know, because this is a book where the people that we're talking to, they're not actively like, they might have been actively promoting something else, but like we're not part of like their press grind. Right. So like they're just doing it, and we can't make like, so it wasn't like, oh, you got to do this thing because like we got to sell more records, we got to sell tickets in Cleveland or whatever. So if they were doing the interview, they already wanted.
Right. They had more of a buy-in than just like, okay, it's scheduled on your calendar and here's your press.
They knew what they were. They knew what they were doing. And like after the beginning, a lot of these bands have been made fun of a lot, but I think after we had been working on the book for about a year or so, like they kind of all know each other because they all
talk and
they'll play shows together. Yeah. And so like the word got out like, oh, these guys are totally into this stuff and they know the stuff and they're not asking like the three. We're probably also asking the three annoying questions, but not only those. So yeah, Vito was cool. And then oddly, like I did one of my beats sort of for this book was I did the whole Vixen story, which was like the only all woman female band from the era. And everybody in that band was like so super cool. Like that. And that was just like super fun interviewing them because it was a different perspective and but just like everybody was super cool and funny. And like, that's the most important thing when you're doing these interviews is it's a little tough because with an oral history, and if I'm drifting, you just like,
oh my God, no, this is fascinating. I'm captivated. No, it's fine.
When you're doing an oral history, you're kind of out of control. Like, so it's all quotes, right? The book for anyone who's listening.
You take the information. Yeah, we should have said, it's an oral history. Yeah. So you take the information and the 200 plus comprehensive interviews and you shape together the story from there because everyone's telling their own individual stories, but clearly y'all have to create some sort of larger purpose, which you clearly do. But you
can't control it.
Right.
It's alive.
You're taking history. It's history. Yeah. It's living history too.
And it's what the people say. Like so it's hard because if like you're talking about like a car crash,
right.
So, like you need three people talking about that car crash so that there's the dialogue,
right? Because it's the truth is in between fact and fiction, right? Something like that.
Yeah, so, it's like it's like a Rashomon thing, and so like you're trying to get all of these people, and so it's really like you have to get people to say things that if you were writing a narrative book, you wouldn't have to you have to get somebody to say like, and then Vince Neil crashed his car because you can't just insert that yourself.
And it's also not a documentary because you're not like filming. So, I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt. You can talk about this after, but I'm also curious to know like how you conducted these interviews and how you then take all this information and archive it. Cause I can imagine, the interview is just the first step and, the book is 400 something pages and you interview 200 plus people and you clearly, only scratch the surface, I imagine. So how do you take all that? I spent
all of my advance money, literally
just archiving it
on a transcription service.
That's what you need
because like I was just like, if I don't get these done, Rich is actually much more like he types faster and he's like, just like,
do you guys record your like tape recorders or like
tape recorder? It was all phone. It was even though
tape recorders.
Tape recorder. Even though micro cassette,
right? Like an 8-track. No.
But even though it was in the before times, we didn't do. I did like 3 in-person interviews, and most of them were phone. We didn't do video. It's weird. Like Zoom just wasn't a thing before.
Yeah, it was like Skype, and that was always like for your friends who live on the other side of there's FaceTime, but that's people weren't using it as like a business tool or a communication tool.
Exactly. So it was all really taped, and we didn't do a lot of video because also like I think for people of a certain age, I mean I'm of a certain age, but if I was like 10 years older, like I didn't want people to like. It's hard enough to get people to sit for these interviews, but like a lot of them were like while people were driving.
Yeah, because they gotta make time. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, or they, and I don't want somebody who's like not comfortable being taped, like worrying about how they're going to look on the thing. Totally, yeah. So it was just like a ton of interviews. And I think Rich transcribed most of his because he's a beast. But he did
it himself. So he literally would transcribe.
He's a monster. He's a monster. He did some transcription service stuff, but
because that takes time. I mean, you got to listen to you can't misquote somebody. So that's crazy.
Yeah. I just blew like literally I maybe now I'm out of the hole on the transcript, but I just knew I wouldn't do it.
Right.
I just knew I wouldn't do it. And then at the end, it would be like a horrible fiasco.
No, it's good that you know yourself.
Yeah. It's like, it's not happening. I would literally, I mean, that is like the bane of every journalist, particularly music journalist. And like, I have transcribed so much in my life that like, what would have happened is not that I wouldn't have transcribed it, is that I would have just put off doing interviews.
I'm like,
oh my God, if I talk to this person, then I have to transcribe it.
Right. So it adds that extra pressure on it. And so you're like, I don't even want to do it.
Transcribing is the worst. And then I'll get off this, but like and then what's really bad, and I'm sure you have it like when you're editing your podcast, is like listening to your, it's not listening to the answer. It's listening to yourself.
I don't watch my own episodes. I made the mistake of in the beginning when I kind of first started this, I was like, I'm going to watch them. Nope. I hate it. I will not. Yeah, it's so bad.
So that was my technique. It's just
because there's no perfect transcription. There's no perfect transcription service. Even like, the Apple voicemail thing. It's like, it doesn't get it right. And then you had just waste your time with all that. Okay, transcript. Good to know. That's the secret. So can you talk a little bit more about, I live in Los Angeles. I live right near the Sunset Strip, and we're all, everything happened. I actually went to a Steel Panther concert at Whiskey Go Go just last month. And I'd love to talk about Steel Panther in a little bit, because I was actually just introduced to them by my boyfriend in like the past year, which is, and I'm like, I'm a Panther. I'm obsessed. And I'd love to know all your thoughts about, I like literally was like, and it was at the Whiskey. So I was literally like 5 feet from Michael Starr. I was like, oh my God. I felt like a groupie in the 80s. It was so amazing, because I think they're one of the only bands I think that can like really make you feel that way. But if you can talk a little bit more about the specificity of place, and specifically, Los Angeles and the Sunset Strip, especially juxtaposed with the more like rough and tumble New Jersey, New England type of bands, what it was like to explore that and to have that come alive in such a, it was a character in itself kind of.
Oh, totally. And like what we kind of didn't understand before we started the book was like you sort of think in your head, like, oh, like the Sunset Strip was always this metal place.
And like, it wasn't, right? Because it was Elton John was at the Troubadour. I know from like Rocket Man, that.
Yeah,
I learned that. Yeah.
But then in like the early, when our book starts, which is like 1981, roughly. I mean, it starts with Van Halen, and Van Halen's on the Strip, and they're playing Gazzarri's, and they're playing Starwood. And then Van Halen got signed like in 1977, and all these other bands that were there, like, and a lot of the guys from the first wave were already there. Like the Dokken guys are already like in different bands and this and that. And they all think they're going to get signed after Van Halen, and they don't. And the reason they don't is at the time, like late 70s through early 80s, the Sunset Strip is not a heavy metal place. It's a new wave and punk place. Like you can, and when you look at like, and these, and like the rock bands, the hard rock bands were really considered to be like this vestigial leftover from the 70s, and the record labels had no interest in them. So there was this weird gap there where it was like the Go-Go's and the Germs and the Plimsolls and stuff. And so they really had to claw their way back. And also when they're starting out, like when Motley Crue's starting in the 80s, like early 80s, and all of these bands, people have this idea that this was like this corporate rock thing, that it was like invented like in a
they can't even play instruments. Yeah.
But these guys were totally DIY, because they were actually operating outside of the mainstream, and the mainstream fully rejected them at that point. But LA and the Strip, the thing that's awesome about it is that it's actually tiny. It's in this giant town.
Yeah, it's crazy how tiny it is when you're actually there.
It's tiny, and it was like this really, like when you look at the beginning of our book, the amount of cross-pollination, like you've got Warren DeMartini from Rat joining Dokken, and George Lynch from Dokken, then he's in Rat for a second, and this one switching to that band. And it was really like probably 200 people, in these bands. They all knew each other. They're all helping each other. They're all competing, but it's actually a very tight scene. And it's also a scene. And this was a really important thing with LA, where LA is a rock town because it's a city, but it's suburban.
It's a weird, I would say it's made up of little neighborhoods that are like thrown together, because there's no real central hub like New York City has.
Yeah. so like people are and it stretches forever, and like you've got people like, I don't even really understand where LA starts and ends, and people are always talking about like, and I was in blank beach, and I'm like, right, Redondo Beach, like, is Redondo Beach part of LA?
Right. It's very confusing. And I don't even know how people like got around. I mean, regardless of like, they didn't have phones and everything. I'm like, the fact that anybody was able to make it and like safely go to a concert and make it home back, I'm like, that's impressive.
But so they were able, so there was this really centralized thing, but there were also radio stations that played rock music in New York. So it's like a rock town. It always has been. You had like Rodney Bingenheimer, and you had like, I think KLOS, and like there was these stations that actually played this stuff. Like when Rat put out their first EP, it got on the radio, and so did the Great White record. And so there was like this supportive infrastructure. And also, when you were flyering, because all these bands would put up their flyers and stuff, they would flyer all over, but like you really just, if you hit the Strip, you were hitting.
And there's so many little venues there, right? Once you're there, you can spend a lot of time there.
Exactly. And so that is sort of the magic of LA. It's that there's all this stuff happening in a very small area, which is also right where the record companies are. Uh-huh. This is before you could just like check out a band's Bandcamp and stuff like, so you actually kind of had to be somewhere where this stuff was happening. But, somebody could walk from Elektra to a show, right, or like you were really in the center of the universe. The East Coast was weirder because the East Coast had a thriving cover scene. Like that was what was going on the East Coast. Like bands like Twisted Sister and Kix and even Cinderella, when they were called, I think, Saints in Hell, they all started as cover bands. And that was what you did on the East Coast. The drinking age was super low. It was like 18. And these guys were all making a ton of money on the East Coast playing covers. Like, I think Dee Snider says in our book that he did the calculation of like adjusted for inflation and the fact that they got paid cash, like how much he was making. He was making like $250,000 a year playing covers because they were drawing 2,000 to 3,000 people like a couple times a week. So this thing on the East Coast was huge. Vito Bratta from White Lion starts in it. All of these guys started cover bands. And it is much more decentralized. The weird thing about New York and the East Coast is that New York City, which is where all the record labels are, is not a rock and roll town.
Right.
It's so you've got bands, and even in the 70s, like you've got the punk bands there, but those are like art rock bands, and like the rock stuff, quote unquote, like
that's
is out in New Jersey. It's on Long Island and blah, blah, blah. So it's all in the periphery. So
because they need space. Do you think it's like the space component? Like they just need the physical space to have the shows and rehearse?
I think it's just that New York Manhattan is, because actually in Queens, like this happened with like even like Twisted Sister and even Kiss both they're getting their fan bases outside of Manhattan. Manhattan has just always traditionally been like an arty place. And so the bands that come out of New York, there are a couple in our book who are from New York, like Spread Eagle and stuff, but mainly bands from New York were like Television and the Talking Heads. And then after that, there was like the no wave movement, like, and it's like Sonic Youth coming out of it. That's what happens in Manhattan. And then like the other bands are happening on the periphery. So they're actually in a weird way more removed from the industry. And they also have this sort of taints of being cover bands, so like nobody, and they're trying to do originals too, it's also like this Faustian thing where you are in a band and you're making all this money playing covers. So it's really hard to be like, okay, I'm going to go play to 12 people
and see if I can make an original song a hit when you don't know if it's going to work out. Yeah. Yeah.
And Twisted Sister does it successfully and Kix do it successfully. And a couple of the band and Tom Kiefer basically is in this cover band from Cinderella, is making all this money playing covers. And like one day he just wakes up and he's like, no.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, this is a lie. And he basically goes home and doesn't play for a year and writes all like the Cinderella songs. But like, it took a real act of will to pull yourself out of that. And the West Coast was I feel like LA was much more welcoming to original bands and just to like hard rock music in general. So you've got hard rock happening where the music industry is, on the East Coast, you've got hard rock happening on the periphery
Yeah.
And so that's a big difference. Like if a dude from a label has to like drive an hour and a half to see your band play in somewhere in New Jersey, the odds of him going are lower.
Yeah. You're taking a much bigger risk being in.
Yeah. So you're just like, so that was the I think a really big difference between, and a lot of the bands also mentioned in the book, like the guys in Poison, when they were trying to decide between moving to New York or LA, and they're trying to figure it out. And it's sort of what we were saying before I think you started taping. Like, I mean, it seems, given the fact that there, as far as I can tell now, like your homeless problem has completely exploded. Like it is not like some cakewalk to live in LA. It's not like, oh, there's money coming out of that.
Yeah,
but in a weird way, there's a quality of life there. Maybe because it's not freezing and this, that, the other thing.
Yeah, I would say because you can see the sky. Like even if you're I don't live in a great neighborhood of Los Angeles, but it's still like you drive one block. It's also the zoning is very weird and different here too, where it's just like totally, like I said, I don't live in a great neighborhood, and the real estate property is just like, so it's becoming like New York in that aspect. But I think again, the space, there's something about the like confinement, and New York is always just so like, busy. And here the pace of life is just a lot more lackadaisical, which, do you think there was almost like an oversaturation here though? If like too many people came to LA?
I mean, by the end, yes. By the end, I mean, again, like, in the beginning, nothing is happening for any of these bands until Quiet Riot comes out with Come On Feel the Noise, and it's like a massive hit. And then suddenly, like the label's like, oh, we can make money off these guys.
Right.
And like musicians have always moved to LA, but by the end of the decade, like in the 86 on, you've just got people moving, like it becomes totally oversaturated, and there are people imitating bands that already exist. And then part of like the undoing of this genre is that everybody started copying. What happens in every genre, started copying everybody else. But yeah, you had just people moving to LA, and it was completely oversaturated. The first wave of bands were actually basically from LA. I mean, Nikki Sixx was from Seattle.
They were like West Coast, yeah.
But they were West Coast, and they were like, they were sort of there. Like all the Rat guys are from LA or San Diego. The Dokken guys, same thing. They were like locals. So I think people do, like, it does by the end, it becomes insane. By the end of like 87, 88, it's just like the Sunset Strip, from all accounts, was just like a total fucking circus. And like, the bands were just, copying. And there was also a parallel scene in LA at that time, which is actually where some of the bands that are lumped into this genre came through. That was more of like the Melrose scene, which was like clubs like Scream and stuff like that, which is actually like, there's all these other clubs, more gothy things, where like Jane's Addiction is playing shows with Guns N' Roses, and like maybe sometimes Faster Pussycat and the Hangman. So there was actually a whole other sort of like more dark, sleazy scene off the Strip, because in a weird way, the Strip had become this place where bands came out of the Valley and came and played on Friday night and then left. So it already had a rep in sort of like Times Square, I think, in New York now. Like if you're from New York, you don't go to Times Square.
Yeah, it's like here, you don't go to Hollywood Boulevard. I mean, or even Sunset Strip. It's like almost touristy now. It's like Rainbow Room now has a gift shop and they sell keychains, and like that's
yeah. So but they were very different. The LA and East Coast scene were very different, and they end up merging. But that we really tried to make sure that we had both of those things represented. So, and there's enough bands coming from both sides that we were able to. A couple bands that came from other places actually ended up getting left out of the book, not because we didn't get good stories, but because there just wasn't enough connective tissue to weave them in. Like Enough's Enough are from Chicago, and we just couldn't weave them in. Dangerous Toys are a band from Austin. Like it just like, we got a great interview from the singer, but there was no dialogue to be had because they weren't from one of these scenes.
Yeah, so it just didn't make sense.
It just couldn't, and it sucked because like you feel bad too. You interview somebody for 90 minutes and then like 3 years later, the book comes out and they're like, we apologize to everyone in the back that we did that.
That's cute. Yeah. Because I mean, you have to
just to not be totally whack.
There's no way. I mean, I'd rather not be in it, but at least acknowledge versus like putting it in just to put it in is a little bit too gratuitous.
It just doesn't work with this format. You just get like stuff like there, and then we could have maybe put one quote in at the end, like when we're talking about all these bands getting blown out, but it's kind of weird to just have somebody appear.
Right. Exactly. It just sort of feels like pages. You're like, whoops, we forgot, where can we squeeze this in? It's like, hopefully they understood.
But they were tough decisions. These are like that's the kind of thing where it's good to have a co-writer. Cause like, I mean, these are like, we weren't just like, oh, fuck them. You're like, it would be like me and Rich being like, what are we going to do? We can't fit in enough's enough. And we're like, but we love enough.
Right. It's like, it doesn't mean you don't love it.
And we're like trying to figure it out. But like, it's really, that's where it's really, I mean, a lot of places, but really useful to have a sounding
more than just like, asking somebody who knows the scene, but it's someone who really knows your book and your vision and is like, okay, this is going to work or it's not.
Nobody else has like, that's the thing, like when I used to be in bands, I had a manager once who, one day, I think he was pissed at me one day. He's like, look, man, I'm going to manage a lot of bands. You have one career. And like, that's the thing. Like you can talk to anybody you want, but like the other person who's got their name on the book is going to think harder about the question that, because they will suffer the consequences as well. So
you guys got 50-50 culpability. So
yes, exactly.
It's not like featuring. It's you guys both have equal.
I blame Rich for everything that went wrong. Yeah.
I mean, that is nice too, because if someone said, why did you make this? I can't. It wasn't my idea, but he wanted it. He was playing the other, and he's not here right now. So I'll take your word for everything. So I'd love to talk a little bit more then about the decline and the end of hair metal and transitioning to the 90s and how you were able to sort of navigate that. And you're not dissing Nirvana or Pearl Jam by any means. It's not a book about them. So how you're sort of able to navigate that transition and what did you learn yourself about that time?
I think what we kind of learned is that, well, first of all, I will say this, is that the fact that we did this book now made it much easier to do, because like a lot of these bands, the 80s hard rock bands, like in the 90s, like they were like literally, it was like having been, like they were canceled. Like there's never, part of my passion for this genre came from the fact that it was absolutely just like you could not even say that you had been in one of these bands. Like I always use this example because it's so crazy, is like this guy, Brian Forsyth, who's one of the best people to interview. He was the guitar player in Kix and he's all over the book. Talks in the end of the book when it's about the like decline of the genre, about how after Kix had broken up, and now mind you, Kix had a platinum album and like a #9 Billboard hit with their power ballad, Don't Close Your Eyes. So like they were a real band. They were like chumps, but that he like 93, 94, he's in LA and he's going to audition for the Wallflowers, and like literally does not mention that he's like, they're like, oh, so what have you done before? It's like, oh, I played with this band here in LA, this blues band. Like he wasn't like, oh, I was in Kix. And because he knew that would just be like immediate disqualification because you were tainted. And so that's sort of one of the things that fascinated us about this music is the arc of it. Like every genre declines eventually, grunge really only lasted like 5 years or 6 years before like the new metal guys came in, and but no, I mean, there are few genres where it was like a bird flying into like a plate glass window. It was just like boom, done. And the bands were just completely like taken by surprise and devastated. So anyway, my point going back to 4 minutes ago was, if we had tried to do this book like in 1997 or 8, these guys guys and the women obviously too, were all incredibly depressed and like trying to figure out what to do with their lives. And now, and like after 2000, it started turning around. There was like this big concert in Oklahoma called Rocklahoma where these bands played, and it like actually was like a success. And these bands started touring again, and Poison came back and like was filling arenas. And suddenly and grunge had sort of dissipated. So you've really got like things, you've got new metal bands who were much friendly, like who had all grown up on, Corey Taylor from Slipknot wrote our
your intro. Yeah.
He's fully like so it was a much more hospitable environment. And now in I guess we were doing the interviews in like 2016, 2017, these guys and these bands are all working again. So they're actually in a good headspace. But the end of the era was absolutely brutal. And what we learned though is like, people are just like, Nirvana took out the hair metal. Like
right. That's what it's sort of like, they released their first album and is like, bye.
Yeah, bye. But it was really happening before. What we really learned is like, it's totally happening before. Like, by 1989, I mean, with the exception of maybe like Dr. Feelgood, which people can argue is like Motley Crue's most accomplished record, none of these bands are doing their best work anymore. It had been a long run. Like if you want us, that's why we would, like the first Motley Crue record comes out in 81, Twisted Sister is like 83. So you're looking at like 7, 8, 9 years of these bands. And the bands that are getting signed by like 1990 are bands that they're not kids who grew up on like Zeppelin and Sabbath and Judas Priest, like the guys in Motley Crue.
Right.
They're kids who grew up on Motley Crue.
Right.
And Poison even, like, oh, I got my, if you were like 20 in 1989, maybe you got the Poison record when you were 15 and so it's really like the snake is starting to eat its own tail already. And so quote unquote grunge and alternative rock did not like take out a genre that was at the peak of its powers. I don't know. Like,
it was the dying horse and the straw that broke the camel's back, sort of.
Yeah, like Poison had like already lost CC DeVille, who was my spirit animal. And Fred Corey actually from Cinderella, who was the drummer, and he's really smart. And he said, in our interviews with him, he's like, look, by that era, we were kind of damned if we didn't, damned if we didn't. Like if we did the same record for the 5th time, we would get shit. And then if we changed, which is what Cinderella did, and sort of became more of like a Black Crowes blues rock band, then they alienated their fans. So like there was not really that much room to maneuver. People were tired. People had been doing drugs. They were just been on the road for so long that I think that they were fried out. But there really is this period like, 89, 90, 91, where, you've got these bands doing really well. You've also got Jane's Addiction coming out. You've got, I saw Extreme open for Alice in Chains in New York in like Extreme
was like late 80s, right?
They were like late 80s, but they were like, they were a full, but
they liked them in the 90s too, right? They were a crossover.
But there was just these band. Well, they kind of got iced. Everybody got iced. Yeah. No one came out alive. But the point being is that, for a while there was like a cohabitation. Like you had bands like Alice in Chains touring with, alternative, like with hair metal bands, but then with alternative bands, you had Skid Row having Pantera open for them, like, and trying to get Nirvana to open for them. Like there was a period, Soundgarden would go out with like hard rock, like there was a period of coexistence, and Kim Thale from Soundgarden and Jerry Cantrell from Alice in Chains are emphatic, because we interviewed them for the book, that they did not get, like, they're like, we did not get into, also, if you see early pictures of Alice in Chains, they're totally glam. But they're like, we did not get into music to destroy another music. They're like, that would be the worst reason to ever get into. So they weren't trying to take out, but it was sort of all existing together. And what did happen, and so like, so really the damage was done. Like MTV had already decided, like, we're going to play Alice in Chains, we're going to play Jane's Addiction, Been Caught Stealing. And then like the Nirvana thing, I think, is just the final, like you said, it's like the Jenga block. Yeah. And also the fact that And a lot of the guys in our book say, like, the first time I heard Teen Spirit, they either say one of two things or they say both. They were like, I thought it was awesome, or I knew we were fucked, or I thought it was awesome and I knew we were fucked. But that song, and I think that song might have more to do with it than Nirvana itself. Like that, I like that's like a Kennedy gets shot moment. Like I actually remember the first time I heard that song, and I was like, oh shit, you know, like this song is amazing. That song is so catchy and so well done. And literally that song in Nirvana caused MTV and radio to shift.
Yeah.
And after that, none of these, like, that's where suddenly when the MTV and radio doors close, the bands are done, you know, like that's it. And I think that Kurt Cobain himself personally hated hair metal.
Yes, he's kind of like the antithesis to a sort of
he thought it was homophobic. He thought it was sexist, and he had like zero tolerance. He was very ahead of his time, and like he was like zero tolerance, racism, homophobia, you know, and so like the fact that Guns N' Roses had a song where, you know, like Axl Rose says immigrants and FAGG, blah, blah, blah. Like that was like like Guns N' Roses wanted Nirvana to open for them. And like Cobain's like, no, fuck that guy. He's like, you know, that guy is,
he's a racist.
He's a homophobe. He's a racist. And like, so like, even though in that song, I believe that Axl is in the voice of someone else, but like, whatever, it was a non-starter for Cobain. And as sort of like the spiritual, whatever, you know, leader of the thing that everybody was aspiring to, and like the most successful guy and the best looking guy in grunge. Like, I think that his attitude became sort of the cool stance, you know, and so that people followed his lead on that. But like, make no mistake, like it was, you know, the producers who had produced these records that had sold like tens of millions of records, like did not work anymore. You know, A&R guys who had signed these bands, like bands wouldn't sign with them anymore because people, like bands were like, I'm not fucking signing with you. You signed Warrant. You suck. Like it was brutal. It was like totally brutal. Like it, and fast. Like by the time I started working at a guitar magazine in 1994, it's like and if you look at guitar magazines from earlier, it's all those dudes on the cover, one after the other. It's like it never happened. You know, it was really intense and hostile. And like a lot of these people in these bands, like they just went underground. Like Cher Ross was the bass player in Vixen. She actually got like into this band Havana 3 a.m. She was like replacing the dude from The Clash in there, and she like made it out, but like she never mentioned that she was in Vixen. And some people just got like totally crushed, you know? So it was a really, I think, a devastating time for the people in these bands, because it wasn't just that they had fallen out of fashion. It was that they were being labeled like dumb and idiotic and vapid. Like that. I mean, as much as I use it as a term, you know, the term hair metal is completely derogatory and dismissive.
Yes.
Like, you know, when you actually think of that, which is why there's a reason it's not on the cover of our book. You know, we might have sold more books if it said like the history of hair metal, you know?
Right. But it is demeaning. Yeah. It
was demeaning, and we didn't want to have like interviewed all these people and then be like, but like, so really this stuff was like written off as complete and utter fluff and bullshit. And now, you know, another 20 years after that, it has sort of, I think probably begrudgingly by some people, but like been accepted, like that the song Nothing But a Good Time is part of classic rock, you know, like it is now part of classic rock, and it's completely changed. But it was like, I mean, look, as a guitar player in 1992 or 3, which is like right when I got out of college, I am old.
Age is just
like,
a number.
I was a metal kid, right? And like I also was really into Husker Du and the Replacements and all kinds of like indie rock. So, but like, I literally knew that I had to change the way I played guitar and erase any sign of 80s-ness from my playing.
Crazy.
Or be doomed. And lots of people did. Like, you just had to do it. Like, it was like a non-negotiable thing. It was like, you just could not, it wasn't cool or funny or like wink, wink or whatever. It was just like, if you like did some like metal lick, that people would just be like,
Get
go
up.
away.
That's crazy. Yeah. And then basically a decade later, then you kind of start to get stuff like the Osbournes, and then you start to get into sort of the sort of postmodern sort of the tongue-in-cheek poking fun. I mean, I find the Osbournes fascinating. Not like a couple of years ago, I rewatched Rock of Love. Wow. But I mean, I have to say, like, that was one of my first introductions to Bret Michaels. I'm younger. I remember my mom watching that show, and I'm like, who is Bret? I'm like, wait, he looked like that, and now he's on this show. Like, but it's like, that's amazing. Like, that's how I felt. Like Ricky Rackman, I have a Cat House sweatshirt now because I rewatched that show, and I was like, I love Ricky Rackman. He's amazing. I follow him on all his social media, and like, he's still relevant to me. But I think there's sort of this looking back for me. It's like a nostalgia for a time that I wasn't even really a part of and alive, and this sort of like wanting, there's not even a word for it really, but this wanting something that I've never had, and also glamorizing literally this time when it probably was, especially for women, probably not the best time to be around, but the music is, and it's undeniable. And I think we have to recognize too that like people change and times change, and this is a piece of history. And just because someone's going to sing this song now and maybe say something that's like not the most PC, it's like, it's not the end of the world.
That was really like a concern for Rich and I too. Like,
because you'd be like, why is this relevant, and all the misogyny and where are the women? It's like, that just wasn't part of the time. You're right. So there's really only one dominant women band.
We've done interviews though where we're like just getting hammered about that, and it's like, and I understand, people are like, well, wasn't it sexist? And I'm like, yes, but it was also the year, these records came out the year that Porky's came out, and everybody had Heather
it's like,
Thomas
look at it, 16 Candles. They're literally stealing a girl's
underwear. It doesn't make it right.
Right.
But like, these were dudes, like, not like, most of these guys were very working class, not college educated guys playing in rock bands, and like, they grew up on Judas Priest and AC/DC, and they're not like even like thinking about what they're writing about. Just like, they're like, oh,
this rhymes,
like music. Yeah. But it was a really fine line for us to walk with this book of like, because there's stuff that's not in the book. You know what I mean? Like, there's like gnarly stuff that we did not put in the book, because it's like, well, okay, what is a funny groupie story?
Right.
And what is a horrifying groupie story? And like, where are we? And most of the guys at this point are smart. Like, they're, like, they
have daughters now, hopefully, and they understand.
Yeah, and they know, like, they're not going to tell you like the worst stuff, but we heard some really bad, and like, again, like, we just didn't put it in because like, it's not like, because we're not going to like,
that's not what you're there to do. That's not, I mean, you're not there to, but sorry.
No. And also, but the problem is like, with this oral history format, like, we're not editorializing, right? So like if there's like some nasty thing that happens and we just put it in there, like, we're not putting, there's no like footnote, like, the authors actually think this is really bad.
Right.
And you can't have your shit both ways either, because like, when you hand in a book like this, like, our editor, actually, Mark, is awesome. Mark, Resnick, and he, but there's an expectation when you do a book on 80s hard rock, like, you have to have some stuff in there.
Sex, drugs, and like, rock and roll. I mean, that's what it is.
But like, so there's an expectation of that, but you can't then like go, and I think I'll not patting ourselves on the back, but I think mostly we made the right calls of like, you can't talk out of both sides of your mouth and be like, we put this thing in and that's really reprehensible. But, if you want to like quote it and put it on social media and maybe like buy, it'll sell us 8 more books. Great. So we really tried, because it is a weird, it's a weird thing. Like, the women who we spoke to who were in the business like Bryn Bridenthal, who was Molly Cruz publicist, or Sharon Osbourne, or Fleur Ephemeyer, who was like one of the stylists who did all of these bands. Like they do not like report it being actually that toxic. You know, that does not like mean that the, like, in terms of like the guys in the band and stuff, like, so I don't know, but like, it seems like people who were working in it were treated.
It's usually the periphery. It's almost like the periphery people who are not like, because they're managed. They're looking, of course it wasn't like you could take a picture on social media and tweet it back then, but they knew they were under the public eye. And I think, not all of them took that as seriously as others, but it's the periphery people that you got to watch out for. It's like the substitute manager who's there for a couple of shows. And you're like, what's his story? I don't know.
And people did get chewed up and spit out. So like, but it was it was a completely different time, and these people were so young. You know what I mean? Like the guy from War, Jerry Dixon, the bass player. Like when we're talking, like, for all of the bands, we talk about when it, like, the era ends, and like he's in the 3 Warrant records, and had these platinum records and toured or played in arenas or blah, and like when the thing goes south, like in 1991, he's 25.
Crazy.
Do you know what I mean? Like he's 25.
He's got his whole life ahead of him still. Yeah.
But like also that means that, like, I wouldn't want to be near any medium or large group of 25-year-old males or 20-year-old males like that. You know what I mean? Like, so it's actually amazing that it wasn't like, much worse. So, but yeah, it was a tricky thing. We definitely acknowledged that we didn't want to like have that like completely just like derail the narrative though. Because you could just be like, oh, you feel bad. And like, that probably wouldn't have gotten us very good interviews either.
No, I mean, again, I think that's just a totally different angle, not to discount it. I think it is important and I think it is a story to be told, but there's only so many avenues you can go and directions you can take. And I think, acknowledging it, just, we know it's bad, but then we have bands like Steel Panther now who sort of transcend that and they take everything that happened. And I am just still obsessed.
But they're disgusting.
That's what I'm saying. But that's what I love about them. I think that the fact that they're so over the top, I mean, I have to be careful sometimes when I'm like blasting their music in my car and I forget, because I'm just like, their tunes are great. I think their lyrics are I think that's what's also great about them is their lyrics are thoughtful in their disgust. I think a little bit of sometimes, back in the 80s, it's like, all right, we're just going to talk about chicks and whatever. With them, it's like, it's the intentionality. And I think drawing attention to the, laughing through pain. Comedy is the best way to deal with tragedy and the perhaps darker things in our past. What do you think?
Also, like, it takes real courage for them. I mean, courage might not be the right word, but like, they know it's wrong.
That's what I'm saying. What are your, it's like, they know it's wrong because they view it as they're acting. And I think that's sort of the difference. It's like, Michael Starr is different than Ralph Sands or whoever. Whereas like Bret Michaels of Poison was kind of still Bret Michaels behind the stage too. I think for them too, they're able to more separate it because it's like, he's married. I follow his wife on Instagram and I think it's hilarious. And I'm like, she just posts about their kids and she's like an actor and everything. And he's going up on stage talking about fucking 17 girls in a row. And I'm like, but it's just amazing. I'm like, it's a very different perspective.
They're super funny.
Have you met or have you? Really, he's such a talented.
I've met Satchel a couple times.
He's awesome. Sticks. And then now I saw they had one of because they're trying to find a new bass player because Lexi left the band.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Lexi. I don't know what happened exactly. It's a little mysterious. They claim it's because he's like working on Botox for dogs or something. Their cheesy, stupid thing. But they don't know there was they had like auditions for it. So they're touring with they're trying to figure out their replacement, but no, Satchel, I think he teaches guitar too. So he brought up a kid on stage. That's what's awesome too, is they're like giving back and they're encouraging like the next generation. They had like a 19-year-old kid come up and do the guitar solo in Panama. And he's one of Satchel's students at the Guitar Institute. So I'm like,
oh, wow.
It was really cool. And it was really cool. They brought up a girl on stage for Weenie Ride, and she was like an 18-year-old lesbian, and it was her first ever concert. And she was having just a fantastic time. And I was like, this is amazing. Like, that's what rock and roll is all about. And that's the beauty. And it keeps on going at the Whiskey A Go-Go too, like at a place where all these bands played, and it's still 2021, and we're still able to like, someone who's 10 years younger than me even is like their first concert. I'm like, wow.
That's great. That's awesome. Yeah, I saw them there out there when I don't remember when, but they were great.
Yeah, I mean I think too. It's like with hair metal, but Steel Panther too. It's like it's more than just wow, I'm going to see a singer songwriter and they're very musically talented. They connected with me, but it's really like a theater like the hair metal with we didn't even get to talk about the outfits, and that's a whole other thing too that I was fascinated about.
There are people with who feel like actually that Steel Panther is like Eddie Trunk is actually one of them. He said it in an interview, so I'm not even talking at school. Like he feels that like that they're perpetuating a negative stereotype. Like he's like they're making it seem like, and I understand his argument, like that they in a weird way, even though I understand what they're doing.
Right. It's like, well, you're doing
every
it
bad
still,
thing about this music,
I think that's a really like surface way of looking at it though. Cause it's like, it's going to be around no matter what. And it's there and it's part of our history that we can't erase. And if you're going to have a good time, and as long as you understand that, like, you actually should not do the things in these songs. And the way that they seamlessly, like, there's a bit in like one of their songs where he's like talking to a cop. He's like, yeah, can I see your warrant? He's like, I got your first album, but you can't have it. It's like the way that they're also like acknowledging their age. Cause there's multiple songs too, where they talk about like being in their 50s. And I'm like, that's what I love too, is cause it's like, it's not timeless. They are very aware that they are old. They're not trying to sing songs that they wrote when they were 18.
And they were probably they were probably just old enough that they were probably in some of the like tail end bands.
Yeah, I think they all kind of started in like early 2000s is when they started performing. And I think they were another band called Metal School before, and then their first album was in 2009. And again, this is all recent. I can't claim that I'm like a longtime Steel Panther fan, but I can say that now I am a big fan. So
it seems you're all in. Yes,
I'm all in. Yeah, I'm all in. Well,
are you wearing a Steel Panther shirt?
Yeah, I actually am wearing a Steel Panther shirt. You can't really see it, but it's from their tour. And this is not sponsored, but I sound like I'm like an obsessive fan. I'm not, but I do like them a lot. Well, before we go, I have one last question for you. Yes. If you could, especially since you're a musician, if you could tour with any band, or if you could have been in any band back in the 80s, which band would it have been?
Oh, man. I mean, the thing is, like, I would have probably wanted to be, well, no, I want to be CeCe DeVille, but if I was in Poison, then CeCe DeVille would not be in Poison, and so therefore Poison would be ruined. I would say, because it seems like a manageable head trip, I think either Kix, who I love, or Skid Row. I think those would be the two that like I would feel like that I could handle the musician. Everyone else, you remove somebody from the band and they're done. But I could have probably done either of those. I love both of those bands. I mean, again, I would probably just if Poison needed an extra guitar player,
right? You'd be like their like second guitar.
Yeah, exactly. But he like my I don't know, just something about his attitude and like CeCe's attitude, and just like everybody's like, oh, he doesn't play that good, and I'm just like, he is joy.
Like he is really fantastic to watch. Like any Poison music video, you're like, wow.
Yeah, I thought he was the cool. Like when I was 15, I was like, that's who I want to be, and that's what ruined my life.
I can imagine. So it's like as a 15-year-old, but like that's who you look up. No, I think you're probably you're writing New York Times bestsellers. Look at you.
That is true. Phew, that was boy, were we lucky.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah. This has been wonderful. We'll chat for a second after I stop recording. Okay. But I will link your book below. Do you have any final parting words? Anything else for the listeners / viewers, or just, stay rocking?
Stay rocking.
Keep rocking. Yeah. Keep reading.
Rocking
keep reading.
Go support these bands. Go see them when they come
live
play your town.
music and listen to their music. And if you're reading anything exciting, as always, let me know. And make sure you check out Tom and Rich's book. And until next time, stay reading, everyone. Thank you again, Tom.